You are sitting in a metal tube at 35,000 feet, moving at 550 miles per hour, and somewhere above you, not that far above actually, the sky becomes a place where your airplane simply cannot exist. Not because of regulations, not because the pilots decided to stop climbing, because physics itself puts a wall up there, and no engine ever built can push through it. That wall has a name, and by the end of this video, you'll understand exactly why it's there, what it's made of, and why crossing it would end your flight in the worst possible way. Let's start with something most people never think about when they're on a plane. Air is not nothing. It has weight. It has density. And at sea level, that density is doing something absolutely critical for the plane you're sitting in. It's giving the wings something to bite into. A wing generates lift by accelerating air over its curved upper surface, which drops the pressure above the wing relative to below it. That pressure difference, multiplied across the entire surface of both wings, is what holds a 400,000-pound airplane in the sky. But here's the thing. That equation only works if there's enough air mass moving over those wings in the first place. At sea level, the air density is roughly 100%. What you'd expect, it's the baseline. At 10,000 feet, you're already down to about 70%. At 20,000 feet, around 50%. By the time you get to 40,000 feet, you're working with about 25% of the air density you'd have on the ground. And at 50,000 feet, you're looking at less than 12%. I remember sitting in a long transatlantic crossing a few years back, the kind where you're bored enough to actually stare at the flight map for 20 minutes at a stretch. The plane had been locked at 38,000 feet for hours. No climbing, no descending, just holding that altitude with almost mechanical precision. I remember thinking, why doesn't it just go up? There's still sky up there. What's stopping it? That question stuck with me long enough that when I landed, I spent the better part of an evening going down the physics rabbit hole. What I found was more interesting than I expected. Because here's where it gets counterintuitive. The engines aren't the limiting factor. Not in the way most people think. And this is where I have to push back on how this topic usually gets explained. If you search online, you'll find dozens of videos and articles that tell you airliners don't fly higher because the engines lose power at altitude. And yes, that's technically accurate. A turbofan engine at 45,000 feet produces maybe 20 to 25% of the thrust it generates at sea level because the air is so thin that the engine can't ingest enough mass to combust efficiently. But framing that as the reason is, in my view, completely missing the point. Because here's the truth. Even if you strapped infinitely powerful engines onto a commercial aircraft, it still couldn't safely operate above 50,000 feet. The engines are just one piece of a much deeper problem. The real issue isn't propulsion. It's aerodynamics. And specifically, it's what happens to the window of safe flying speed at extreme altitude. If this is new to you, take a second and hit that like button. Because what comes next is the part they never teach you in those little safety cards. Every aircraft in the air is balancing between two speed limits at all times. The first is the stall speed, the minimum speed the aircraft needs to maintain to keep generating enough lift to stay airborne. Go below that speed, and the wings stop flying. The aircraft falls. The second is the maximum operating speed, the point at which the airframe and control surfaces start experiencing dangerous aerodynamic forces. Exceed that, and you risk structural damage or losing control of the aircraft entirely. At sea level, those two limits are far apart. A commercial airliner at sea level might stall at around 140 knots and have a maximum operating speed above 350 knots. That's a gap of over 200 knots. Room to maneuver, room for error, room to breathe. Now watch what happens as you climb. As altitude increases and air density drops, the wings need to work harder to generate the same lift. To compensate, The aircraft either flies faster, so more air passes over the wings per second, or pitches up to increase the angle of attack. But there's a limit to both. At the same time, as you climb higher, the speed of sound decreases, because sound travels slower through cold, thin air. And your maximum operating speed is expressed not just in knots, but in Mach number, the fraction of the speed of sound. As the speed of sound drops, your maximum Mach limit translates to fewer and fewer actual knots. So as you climb, your minimum safe speed goes up, your maximum safe speed goes down. The gap between them shrinks, and at a certain altitude, those two numbers converge. That convergence point is called coffin corner. The name is not subtle. Coffin corner is the altitude at which your stall speed and your maximum operating speed meet, where there is literally no safe speed for the aircraft to fly. You are simultaneously too slow to generate lift and too fast to avoid destroying the airframe. And there is nothing the pilots can do. Any change in speed in either direction puts the aircraft into one of two catastrophic failure modes. It's not a malfunction. It's not a weather event. It's just the physics of flying in air so thin it can barely support the concept of a wing. For most commercial aircraft, coffin corner arrives somewhere between 45,000 and 50,000 feet. The exact number depends on the aircraft type, the atmospheric conditions, and, here's something almost no one talks about, the weight of the airplane at that moment. Coffin corner is not a fixed altitude. It moves. An airliner at maximum takeoff weight, fully loaded with passengers and fuel, has a coffin corner that might be several thousand feet lower than the same aircraft 6 or 7 hours into a long-haul flight, after it's burned through 50 or 60 tons of fuel and gotten significantly lighter. The lighter the aircraft, the higher it can safely climb before those speed limits converge. This is why commercial flights do something called a step climb. If you've ever been on a long flight and the pilot announced you're climbing from 36,000 to 38,000 feet, 3 hours into the journey, that's exactly what's happening. The aircraft has burned enough fuel to climb higher safely, so it does, because thinner air means less drag, which means better fuel efficiency. The plane is chasing its own coffin corner as it gets lighter, always staying just below it, extracting every bit of efficiency the atmosphere will allow without crossing into the danger zone. And by the way, if you've never heard the term coffin corner before, drop a comment below. I'm genuinely curious how many people who've flown hundreds of times have never been told about the thing that puts a hard ceiling on every single one of those flights. Now back to the engines. Because they do matter, just not for the reason most explanations give you. The issue isn't just that the engines produce less thrust at altitude. It's that the way turbofan engines work makes them fundamentally dependent on air density to function at all. A turbofan works by sucking in a massive volume of air, compressing it, mixing it with fuel, igniting it, and expelling the hot exhaust rearward. The thrust comes from the difference in momentum between the air coming in and the exhaust going out. At sea level, the engine ingests dense air at high mass flow rates. The combustion is efficient. The pressure ratios across the compressor stages work the way they were designed to work. As you climb and the air thins, mass flow drops. The compressor has to spin faster to maintain pressure ratios. The combustion becomes less stable. And, at a certain point, the engine hits what's called its aerodynamic ceiling, the altitude above which it simply cannot maintain the thrust needed to keep the aircraft flying at safe speed within the coffin corner window. So what you actually have at around 50,000 feet is a perfect convergence of three separate physical limits. The wings can barely generate enough lift in air that thin. The margin between stall speed and maximum speed has collapsed to near zero, and the engines are producing a fraction of their rated thrust. None of these three problems can be solved by engineering alone. They're not design failures. They're the atmosphere telling you, This is where commercial aviation ends. Which is why when you look at the aircraft that do operate at extreme altitudes, the U-2 reconnaissance plane, for instance, which cruises around 70,000 feet, they look nothing like a commercial airliner. The U-2 has wings that span nearly 100 feet on an airframe that weighs almost nothing. It flies with an extraordinarily slow stall speed, which means it can operate near coffin corner without immediately falling into the gap. Pilots who fly the U-2 describe the experience as walking on ice. There is almost no margin for error in any direction, and a single mistake in pitch or airspeed puts the aircraft into an unrecoverable situation. And that plane carries one person, not 300, not 250,000 pounds of fuel and cargo and luggage and human beings. The commercial aviation industry decided quite reasonably that an acceptable cruising altitude is one where if something goes wrong, an unexpected updraft, a mechanical issue, a miscalculation, there is enough buffer between you and catastrophe to do something about it. 35,000 feet gives you that buffer. 50,000 feet does not. So the next time you're on a long flight, staring out the window at the dark blue edge of the atmosphere and wondering what's up there, now you know. Up there is a place where the sky stops being a resource and starts being a trap, where the air is so thin that going faster kills you, and going slower also kills you, and the only safe option is to stay right where you are. Subscribe to Matt the Engineer if you want more of this, and go watch one of the 2 videos on screen right now, because I promise the engineering behind them is just as strange as what you just learned about the sky.